All right, Marginal Gainers, welcome back and welcome to another suspension discussion, question mark. Yes, we're going to really test our luck here, Josh, with our audience. We're going to double up on the suspension talk. You know, we had one discussion already regarding data acquisition and telemetry and the monitoring of suspension and how World Cup racers kind of use that information to help them get set up. And Josh said, Hottie, why don't we talk to Darren Murphy of Push Industries? He's a great mind in this space too, and a friend. And I thought, okay, I'm down for that. And as long as the audience is cool with it too, and I hope you are, we're going to get into more compression and dampening talk and rebound and G-outs and whatever else goes on with suspension and suspension setup. So Darren Murphy of Push Industries, thanks so much for being on the Marginal Gains show.
Yeah, no, super appreciate the opportunity. So looking forward to having a really good discussion about all things bump.
Ooh, bump. Yeah, we didn't use that one. And Hottie, I got to call you out. You said dampening, and that's
yeah. I knew it when I said it.
Cringeworthy, my friend.
That is cringeworthy.
Yeah.
Damping,
So
right? That's
damping.
the right word. Damping.
Yeah.
Dampening is when you get something wet, and then maybe.
Dampening is not really used. It's a very difficult word to use anywhere. You know, I guess your screen door has a dampener on it, but
okay.
Suspension has damping.
Damping.
Wouldn't that still be a
Okay.
damper? Wouldn't that still? That's just a dash pot, right?
I don't know where you would use the term dampening, but it is widely used in bicycles. But it is damping. Simple.
Dampening is really a synonym for another word you can't use, which is moist.
Right.
So we'll just throw that out there for the listeners. Maybe that'll end up on just the YouTube channel and not in the podcast. But yeah, not a popular word. So Darren, you and I known each other, oh my God, a long time. And Darren, for the audience, is someone that I routinely point to when mountain bikes come up, because I don't know squat hardly about mountain bikes. And I always say, oh, Darren's like one of the smartest people I've ever known. And so I just push them to you, knowing that when the situation is reversed, I think you do the same back to me. Yeah. And so it gives each of us nice cover. But so welcome to the show, smartest mountain bike and suspension person I know. We're really thrilled to have you.
Yeah, that's a big one to live up to. That's a real big one to live up to.
So, I mean, get us started. And I think your backstory is, to me, super fascinating. It's not just bicycles. So, I mean, I think it starts maybe with bicycle. Anyway, you kick us off. How did you discover the bike? How did you get into suspension? Let's go from there.
Yeah, the condensed version for me is really early on. I grew up in a very small town in northern Maine called Millinocket. Wasn't a lot happening there. There was a gentleman named John Raymond who had really wanted to have a bicycle store and a BMX racetrack. He was a longtime motorcycle racer and just wanted to have an outlet for kids to, get on two wheels. I got introduced to that sort of, my dad passed away, unfortunately, from cancer when I was 12. And as a young kid, I was pretty lost, looking for an outlet. And my next door neighbor, who was into BMX racing, his family kind of invited me along to look at this BMX thing as a way of just helping to try to pick me up at that age. So I went to the BMX track with them, and it was amazing. It was just, I couldn't believe how many people were there. Again, coming from a small town of 3,000 people, going to a place where, it just was filled with parents and kids and bikes, and the atmosphere and everything about it was just intoxicating to me. And so that kind of started it. I was like, wow, this is really amazing. I had a bike like a lot of kids, but I just kind of used it to get around the neighborhood. Hadn't really thought about anything more. So after that introduction to the BMX track, I decided that, wow, this, I want to get involved with this. This is something I want to do. And so fortunately, I was able to get a BMX bike and had some local friends and family that, would help me out getting me to the track. And I was hooked. And from that point, it was, it became my whole life. I lived on a BMX bike. And got to become very close friends with John and his family, the guy who started the BMX track in the bike store. Yeah, it became a second father to me. And I spent, when at school, I left school, went to his house, went to the bike shop, played with bikes. That was the whole thing. And then as I mentioned, he was really into motorcycle racing and had a bunch of old motorcycle parts. And part of that collection was motorcycle forks and shocks. And I honestly don't know why I was drawn to it, but I just thought that this motorcycle shock was intriguing. And I was very mechanical and wanted to know what's inside this thing, right? Like what's it do? What's inside of it? And so that started the journey to, my interest in suspension, bikes, suspension, motorcycles, all of it.
I love it. I love it. I think of so many of the industry people we have on the show, it starts with the bicycle, and then quickly it's like, and then I started taking things apart.
Right.
And I mean, that's my story, right? Like, oh, I can race bicycles, and I'm not terrible at this thing, but I really just want to take stuff apart and put it back together. And then there's pieces left over, and then you figure out how to put it back together without the pieces being left over. And that's awesome. So from there, you come into the industry at like a retailer level, or what's next for you?
Yeah, I mean, I spent my high school years again just thinking I was either going to be a professional bike racer, a mechanical engineer, or own a bike shop. Right? That's like those were the three things that I was focused on, and so I wasn't really sure what that looked like. And then as high school was ending and the pressure was on to, hey, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I applied at University of Maine and thought, hey, I'm going to become an engineer because I love taking things apart, putting them back together. I want to design things. I want to build things. But at the same time, I was intimidated by that. Wasn't really sure what that looked like. And I also, like I said, just wanted to race bikes because I read the magazines. I grew up reading magazines and seeing everything going on in California, and people were getting paid to race bikes, and I was pretty good at it because I realized because of my size at an early age, not because of total skill, although I had some of that. And ultimately, it was Thanksgiving around this time of year. So it was Thanksgiving back in like 1990. This product manager from Cannondale. So again, my friend John had a high school friend that had gone on to start racing bikes and was living in Connecticut and become friends with a lot of the guys at Cannondale. And one Thanksgiving came back to Millinocket to visit with family, brought along this guy, Rick Beasley, who was a product manager at Cannondale. They were on prototype suspension bikes from Cannondale. It was the original Delta V Cannondale prototypes. And so I got connected with them. Well, first off, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Here I'm in this town. I'm like the one of maybe two mountain bikers in the town, and to see these guys riding up. I was working at a grocery store at the time, and to see these guys riding up on these radical, at the time, like absolutely radical bikes.
Yeah.
And we started chatting, and I took them on a mountain bike ride, showed them the trails, and Rick started to talk to me about how he was planning on leaving Cannondale and starting a retail store in Connecticut. And my eyes were wide open. I just was like, this is a dream come true. I've got this guy who works at a bike company who's starting, has relationships in the industry. This is kind of what I wanted to do. And so I was playing around with the idea of going to United Bicycle Institute out in Oregon to get a mechanics, certification. And he said, yeah, just if you're going to do that, just call me and let's talk. And so I ended up kind of falling back from the college idea, flew out to UBI, went to school there. And when I got back, I phoned up Ricky and said, hey, I've got my master wheel building certificate. I got my mechanics certificate. I've got all the things. And he said, great, I've got a spot for you. And I packed up all my things and moved to Connecticut and started a job there at Cycle Fitness in Monroe, Connecticut back in 92, I guess it was, or so.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm totally putting myself in your spot of like having your brain exploded by that Cannondale Super V or whatever they called it at that. I mean, I remember when those bikes first started hitting the magazines and it was just like, oh my God.
Yeah,
Like,
radical, absolutely radical. Yeah. Yeah, and these
Uh,
things were just raw, right? They were just raw frames that they'd welded up there at the Bethel, Connecticut,
yeah.
workshop.
Wow.
And I think I can't remember or not if they had head shocks, or I think they did. I think they had the original head shock. And anyway, yeah, it was like a spaceship. I mean, it literally at that point, in 90, seeing a aluminum tubed Cannondale full suspension bike that the world didn't even know existed. Yeah, it was like seeing an alien. It was like seeing a spaceship. I was, I was taken
cool.
for sure. Yeah, it was awesome.
So, and so you're at the shop now, and then is that where you jumped off to go work for Marzocchi, or how did you end up there?
Yeah, so I was working at Cycle Fitness, and that was going really well. I was extremely happy, and mountain bike suspension was growing rapidly. In the early '90s, obviously early and mid '90s. And Marzocchi, we were I think it started because we were a Kona dealer as well. Cannondale was a big brand at the store, but Kona was a big brand for us as well. And I think the Konas at that time were coming with Marzocchi forks. And I was riding and racing a Kona hardtail with a Marzocchi fork, and started again taking it apart, learning how to service, talking to Marzocchi about getting parts and tools. And that grew into like, hey, I want to be a service center for you guys. And at that time, that was a radical idea. And so, because you basically the factories sold the parts and serviced the parts and warrantied the parts, and so the idea of someone else doing it was foreign, and they were open to it. And so I started to befriend those guys at Marzocchi USA, and sure enough, they set me up with being able to purchase tools and parts and pieces, and I was doing a lot of service, and then became kind of known on that New England race circuit. Back then it was the Pedro's, off-road series. And so a lot of people knew me as the guy who could work on the Marzocchi forks. And so that grew to a point where I was pretty successful at it. And Marzocchi said, hey, like, why don't you come to Anaheim and go to Interbike and work the booth with us and talk to dealers about your experience selling and servicing and, those types of things. And so I did. So they flew me out to Anaheim, and I went to my very first Interbike, which was another mind explosion, right? I mean, back in the days of the Anaheim Interbikes, I mean, it was a circus. It was huge.
Yeah.
And so I went out there, and that went really well, which led to them ultimately offering me a position at HQ in California. And so I left the bike shop and took a tech job at Marzocchi USA, just north of LA, which was, again, just the dream kept continuing.
So what, I guess, think of suspension tech. I'm not all that familiar with Marzocchi. I know, like, Manitou had their elastomer stack.
Yeah.
What was inside of a Marzocchi, and what was the damping, or I guess the sophistication of, say, the damper of that era?
So when I started, they were what's called open bath forks. So Marzocchi was air sprung, oil damped, and it was very crude. So you basically had a cylinder with what's called a pumping rod with a single hole drilled in, or multiple holes. And so you had this rod with some holes in it, and you just filled up the cylinder with oil, put a cap on it, pressurized it, and the thing moved up and down, and oil kind of swished in and out of these holes. So it was very, very crude, as a lot of that stuff was, right? Again, we're talking mid '90s, so that was really old school stuff. And so they were sort of effective, but very, very basic. And so working on them was really easy. The tools and parts and pieces, they didn't last very long. It was good that they were easy to work on, because back in the day, all the early Manitou, RockShox, Marzocchi, I mean, you had to constantly maintain that stuff, and so they weren't really good at holding oil inside. I think every mountain biker has some kind of experience. So my job was mainly in-house service, and then I also was put out on the race circuit. So I was the guy that at that time I was an all-in-one, right? I drove the truck to the events. I set up the truck. I worked on all the stuff. I tore down the truck. I packed the truck, all that stuff. So,
wow.
Yeah, most of, I was in California for probably 2 weeks before I was out on the road. So I was just thrown into the wolves. Here you go.
Yeah.
And I love racing. I love motorcycle racing and car racing and mountain bike racing and road I love racing. And so for me, the idea of like, here are the keys, take off, you're going to the races was awesome. It was a really, really great experience.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, and then, so you lead the story, you do end up in car racing.
Yeah. And so, the Marzocchi thing was really, really good. And I was learning a lot. It was limited, right? Because the factory was in Italy, which I did spend some time there as well. But, all the engineering, all of the really deep dive stuff was being done in Italy. And so while it was great being at the US office, I wanted more. I was looking for more than just being a tech. And I thought I had more to offer. And so, fast forward, I was at I think it was the Big Bear National. I was at some race, but anyway, some people from Ibach Springs approached me. And basically, I'm not really sure to this day how they got my name initially, but Ibach at the time and still is, like dominant in cars, right? So when it comes to race cars or aftermarket parts or aftermarket suspension springs for automobiles, motorsport, etc., Ibach dominates. Back then, they were, again, the leader in motorsports and were really wanting to get into the mountain bike and motorcycle space. So they were doing some motorcycle stuff, and Mountain Speed Products back in the day had approached them about making aftermarket coil spring kits for RockShox elastomer forks. So you take out the elastomer and replace it with a coil. And Ibach was really struggling because they're an organization, a global organization that has tons of enthusiasts, like the R&D and the engineers, they all race cars, they really have an intimate working knowledge of all of their products. And they didn't have that for motorcycle and mountain bike. My name had been floated around. They approached me and said, hey, we hear, you obviously love mountain bikes, but we hear you're a big motorcycle guy too. And that kind of started those conversations. They invited me. They said, hey, when you're back in California, just come down to our U.S. headquarters in Irvine. Let's have a chat. And so we set that up. And I was back in California at one point, took a drive down to Irvine from Northern LA and walked into the reception area at Ibach. And immediately it was like, oh, this is a different level. You're like just the lobby, right? Like you walk in and it's like, huh, this is different. And so, I ended up going up into this very large conference room and meeting with a bunch of people and, accepted a position right there and then on the spot as kind of a two-wheel director and R&D guy. So basically, hey, we've got all this engineering and manufacturing horsepower. We need somebody to go and talk to the motorcycle companies and acquire motorcycles and mountain bikes and, tell us, how do we get into this space? So I took that job on the spot and just used the connections I had to, start up a motorcycle and mountain bike R&D program at Ibach. Yeah,
I love it. We get asked a lot about, and I think we've even been asked to do an episode, how to get into the industry. And we've had a number of, yourself, Damon Reinhard. I hear a lot of James Huang's story and your story of like, man, you just get in there and love it and do it and keep doing it and meet people. And then people find you. And it's like, it's a grind, right? I mean, it's an enjoyable grind, but you're just doing it. And then, as we like to joke, 10 years later, you're an overnight success.
Yeah, right. Or 20.
20, maybe 20.
But yeah, for me, it was just riding and racing and working and, I was all in on everything. And you get noticed. I mean, when you're spending all of your waking minutes, it's a passion, right? It becomes, for me, it was a passion. Race cars and motorcycles and road bikes and mountain bikes. I mean, everything. It was just a passion. And you're absolutely right that it just takes it just takes time, and people kind of notice. And when you start climbing up, you meet more people, and it just kind of accelerates. And like you said, 10 years later, you're an overnight success.
Exactly. Okay, so take us to the beginning of Push, right? 2003.
Yeah.
Okay, and sort of your vision there, because now you've got this knowledge, you know what other industries are doing. I'm sure you're looking into cycling and being like, oh man, they're not doing any of this stuff, or could be doing this so much better.
Yeah.
And so clearly you've got this vision, and then you take the leap, and I know that leap. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it really came, it really all started. The idea kind of started when I was at IBOC. The guys at Norco had sent me a new mountain bike. So there's this new Norco mountain bike that I really was interested in, and I had established a relationship with the Norco guys. And they sent me this new mountain bike, and it was a hardtail, but with a front suspension fork. Anyway, long story short, I wanted to service it. I wanted to do some things. And at that time, I was really struggling to find parts and information. And it took me a little bit to get the tools and the parts and the information that I was looking for. And I thought to myself, man, I really know what I'm doing, and it's this difficult for me. What would it be like for the average person, and who doesn't know what questions to ask, who doesn't know where to start? And so that's what kind of started. I was like, man, the mountain bike really lacks an independent resource. You have the manufacturers put out there what they put out, but it's very difficult to ask questions. It's very difficult to find their phone number, right? I need this thing. Where do I find this thing? Yeah. And this was obviously pre-Google. And so you couldn't just Google like fork seal driver and get the right tool or the bill of materials. Like today you can get full schematics online, And so, yeah, that kind of started it. I had left IBOC and was doing some independent projects that kind of started me in entrepreneurship as well. And so I was working on some bike frame stuff, and I was working on some side stuff. I was working on some suspension stuff. I was doing a lot of different things. So I was doing some mountain bike frame stuff. I was doing mountain bike suspension stuff. I was also designing suspension components for some of the top motorcycle teams. And so I was actually, which is a big passion of mine. So I started doing that. And honestly, it came to a point where I got another magazine in the mail, and there was a 5-star product review on something that I developed, but it was under somebody else's name. It was a product I developed independently for a company. And honestly, it started to get a little frustrating, because it's like, man, not that I needed credit, but it's just like, I did all this work and I got paid for it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not angry. I definitely got paid for the work, but I just thought, man, I wish I could do this on my own. And my wife and I started having those conversations of what would that look like? What would it look like if I stopped doing independent design work or contract work, and I just applied my passion for mountain bikes and suspension and all of these things I've learned from motorsports and from racing and from bike racing? Like, what if I combined all of these things and became that independent resource for mountain bike suspension? An expert in the field that people could call. And with her support, we took all the equity we could out of our house and jumped off the diving board and said, "Here we go." And we rented a small space. At that time, we were living in Orange County, California, and rented a small office warehouse space in Irvine, California. And we started Push Industries as being a Fox. It started as a Fox rear shock service and tuning company. And then you could also just ask questions, get resources, and that's how the whole thing started.
That's cool. You're talking about the lack of resources. I remember working at a Grand Performance in the mid '90s, and we had like some of the early, was it the Judy SL, the yellow one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I remember we had a guy come in, and it was like leaking out the bottom, and we're like, trying to figure, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
I remember her calling and talking to the pre-SRAM version of RockShox,
right.
And it was all those guys. And they're like, and I just remember Dan getting off the phone and being like, they said we probably need to buy a new one.
Right.
And you're like, is that how that works? Like, I don't, wait a minute. Like he wrote it 10 times and now it's leaking. And that just means that it's done.
Yeah.
But it was like, especially as a road bike shop, my God, like I don't want to open that thing up. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And you had no parts, even if you could open it up, you had nothing to fix it. So yeah, so that's,
yeah, there was almost no guidance. And actually I'll rewind a little bit because during my time at iBucket, I also had become quite friendly with Paul Theed over at Racetech. So Paul Theed is the guy who started Racetech, which is a motorcycle suspension tuning and servicing and parts. And, they're kind of I had initially approached him. We were at a motorcycle trade show in Las Vegas, and we ended up at dinner one night, and I was selling Paul on this idea, like, hey, take Racetech and just open a mountain bike division. And you just do what you're doing, supply your own, tools and parts, service, tuning, all these things. And he's looking at me cross-eyed, like, you're crazy. I don't know anything. I'm a motorcycle guy. I don't know anything about mountain bikes. He said, you do it. It's a great idea. You just take Racetech's model and you do it. And that also was kind of one of the things that jump started. I thought, well, okay, yeah, maybe. And so I will admit that initially the push concept was just Racetech. I just literally took Paul's idea and applied it to the mountain bike industry.
Darren, I understand at the time, a lot of what was driving your business was the Fox's Pro Pedal platform that was kind of the rage, and a lot of people wanted it. And you were able to take existing shocks and convert them or upgrade them so they would also have that ride characteristic. And that was driving a lot of your business and also drove one of your major developments in life, for that matter, and that is your own shock. So tell us how that worked, how you went from kind of working with other people's ideas to working on your own.
Yeah, that was a pivotal moment for Push. When we started, Fox had just shifted to that Pro Pedal technology, and that was kind of what I used as the jumpstart, because I looked at Pro Pedal and said, hey, we can reverse engineer that and come up with a aftermarket kit. So we can, there's thousands and thousands of Fox shocks that are out there in the world that could be retrofitted with an aftermarket kit. And so I thought that's how I'll get things started, because, my idea was not to be so much of a service company as I wanted to be a tuning company. I wanted to work with, I basically was trying to provide a pro level support to the average rider, because when you go to the races, everybody knows this, right? When it comes to racing, there's all kinds of resources and technologies and things that athletes have access to that general consumers don't. And so with Push, I wanted to be a high performance tuning company. And the start of that was like, hey, I can take and provide an aftermarket Pro Pedal kit. And the timing was perfect, because Fox had put so much marketing behind that product that everybody thought they had to have it, right? I can't ride my bike without it. Yeah. And so, to have that, it's like,
and can you give us a technologically, what was Pro Pedal? Like, what was that solving and how to do it?
Yeah. So Pro Pedal, what it really was so with shock absorber damping characteristics, we basically have digressive, linear, and progressive. And so with the digressive characteristic, you build a lot of compression damping very early in the velocity range, and then it opens up. And with linear, it's just kind of, it's even. It's a nice gentle slope. And then with progressive, it's the opposite of digressive, where it builds towards the higher velocity range. And so what Pro Pedal was really the introduction of digressive damping into mountain bike suspension. So when you're, back in the day, the bikes mechanically weren't as efficient. We didn't have all of the DW links and VPPs. And I don't think the industry had its, was really wrapped around anti-squat and anti-rise and all the things that we focus on these days. It was like single pivots and, like 4-bar suspensions with a lot of leverage. And so, so that digressive so if you had a bike that mechanically wasn't very efficient, you could create a digressive damping characteristic where a lot of low speed compression damping is generated, which opposes the bob or your body mass bouncing up and down in the seat. And so what we would do is we would create kind of a threshold. So the damping would build, to oppose, like movements from the rider, and then any forces above that, it would open up. So you'd kind of have this threshold. The threshold would be met, and then the shock would open up, and that's kind of what digressive damping does, and how that technology worked. And so I created a piston assembly that had checks and balances and had a dished piston, which gave us a preloaded, which took the suspension shims and preloaded them, creating that threshold that once you overcame it, the shims opened up, the shock moved nice and freely. And so that's, it was, and again, that was a widely used technology that I came to learn in motorsports, because the digressive technology in race cars is very common, because you have a car that's doing 185 miles an hour down the straightaway. The driver slams on the brakes and turns in to the corner. And so you want to control chassis roll, but if you're on the curbing, you need the wheels to still, absorb that impact, et cetera. So I was very familiar with digressive damping from the motorsports field and working in motorsports. And so when I saw that Fox had kind of brought that digressive technology to mountain bikes, it was, it was immediately recognizable. And I said, oh yeah, I know how to develop a system that we can install aftermarket.
That makes sense. And so was that like the beginning of like shim stacks, or just preloading on of pistons? We back at Marzocchi, you said it was some holes in the piston, so it's kind of just doing its thing both ways, same, or maybe not quite same, but then you get into, you can shim stack above and below, and you can start to do a ton of stuff. So was that the beginning of that in the mid 2000s there in cycling, or?
No, it was earlier. I mean, Fox.
Okay.
I would say when it comes to Fox, so certainly the other brands were still more basic, but when Fox rear shocks always had a lot of architecture, right? They were always based on, because Fox's experience in motorcycle and off-road trucks and all that stuff. So Fox had always used far more advanced technology than everybody else. And then when they introduced their front fork, which, oh man, that might've been in 2000, I think. Maybe 2000 was when Fox introduced their front fork, which is a fully shimmed open bath cartridge, tunable. It was like, wow, this thing is, Fox was always ahead. And so, the tuning and suspension kind of late 90s, early 2000s was all shimmed. Like the Fox stuff was advanced, was tunable, which is why I picked it, which is why I chose Fox to be what I was going to work on, was because it was the most familiar from a motorsports perspective. And it had real systems, real architecture that you could tune around. And so, we had been able to tune stuff, but it was really that digressive. They get the credit for kind of, bringing that to market, and really changed things, in my opinion. In my opinion, when Fox brought that Pro Pedal system, it really, it took off, and it forced everybody to come up with something. Everybody else had to respond to that.
So by now you're getting thousands of work orders from people who want their shocks retrofitted so they can have Pro Pedal or whatever, or tuning or what have you.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is if I'm an end user, I got to pull my shock off, send it into push. I got no bike for the time that my shock is gone. I got to wait till it gets done. And people, mountain bikers, cyclists, we're impatient. We want to ride now. We don't want to wait. So you came up with a workaround with that led to a product development, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. The suspension tuning business definitely exploded. In the early days, again, nowadays they're everywhere. Suspension tuners are everywhere, but for sure, when I started push, it really wasn't a thing. And so we enjoyed a good 5 years of no competition. And so the business grew very rapidly. And in the heyday, we had, 7 full-time technicians, and we were doing upwards of 10,000 Fox forks and shocks a year. It was a animal. Wow. Yeah, it was a big animal. And so, it was a machine, and it was really good, but you're absolutely right. Once you get to a point where the brand was reputable and we had the legitimacy from a tuning perspective, riders said, why can't I just buy a Fox shock from you? Like, I'll buy an extra one. And then when I have to have it serviced, I'll just take one out of the toolbox that was on my bike stock and then use that while, et cetera. So we started to have conversations with Fox about that, and they weren't interested at all. In fact, the relationship in the, like 2008, 2009 period with Fox was a little bumpy because, the term pushed was flying around mountain bikers, right? Like if you had a Fox fork or shock, you'd get it pushed. And I understand now, back then I didn't think about it kind of the way Fox was, which was, hey, people are saying our product's no good and that you fix it. And that was never the case. My whole thing was, no, we think Fox is the best. That's why we choose to tune it, but I understand now how, with consumers running around saying, oh yeah, no, you have to have it pushed. You have to have it pushed. How Fox would look at that and say, you're marketing this negatively, even though that wasn't the intention. So they weren't very interested in it. We talked to RockShox. We talked to everybody about, hey, can we buy your product? And then we're going to tune it and deliver it as a finished item. And RockShox was sort of interested, and we did that for a brief period of time. But what we realized quickly was that when a manufacturer has a recall or has a product update or something like that, it's on us. And so if we buy a RockShox shock and we tune it and ship it to a customer, well, now if there's a warranty concern or a recall or a product update, that cost is on us, and we don't have control of it. And we may not necessarily be on top of the latest information as quickly as we would have liked. So that was sort of short-lived. So we did it for a short period, but that certainly led to us being in a position where it's like, no, the only way we're going to control this, the only way we're going to be able to do this successfully is if we make our own product, if we control that process somehow. And we put it on the shelf. It was basically like, yeah, this is a great idea, but we put it on the shelf. And it wasn't until years later when I was at Interbike in Las Vegas, and I was having breakfast with a mutual friend of ours, Josh, and we were sitting there talking, and I was venting some frustrations about business growth and this whole idea. And he mentioned to me, he's like, well, you should just make your own shock and fork. Like, you should just make suspension. And I said, man, you can't. It's just too expensive. Like, there's no way I could start up. There's no way we could do that. And this friend said, well, how much would it cost? And I said, I don't know, but it's going to be expensive. He said, well, I challenge you to go back and actually look at what it would cost. So I left that breakfast meeting and was like, okay, whatever. And not an hour later, I was at the Santa Cruz booth, and I ran into Rob Roskop, one of the founders of Santa Cruz, who said, hey, are you still, dinking around with tuning suspension, or are you finally making your own shock? I was like, okay, so maybe I should look into this. And so, 2013 is when we kind of got serious about, okay, let's build our own suspension.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So the mutual friend, I'll name him because we're going to have him on the show here soon, but Andy Ording, the former owner of Zip and actually my partner here at SILCA.
Yeah.
And hearing your story, I wouldn't be surprised if Andy left that meeting and ran around and like, hey, if you see Darren, give him shit about when he's going to make a shock.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
Oh man.
But yeah, it was very funny because he just basically, and he said, go back. Like, you keep saying how expensive it's going to be, but you should actually look into it. And I did. So, and it turns out,
well, he has a way, right? I mean, I think I love him, and he drives me crazy sometimes because he'll really start probing into the stuff that you think you know.
Yeah.
Well, it's too expensive. Okay, what's that cost? Well, I don't actually know what the cost is. Well, then how do you know it's too expensive? And you're like, well, we'll have to sell it for too much. Oh, well, what do you sell it for? I don't know.
Right.
And, he starts just like breaking down the wall, and then eventually you're like, I'll get back to you.
Yeah. It just makes
but by then your head's spinning, and that's awesome.
Yeah. It makes you ask all the questions. And so we did. So we looked at what it was going to cost and what we thought we could do. And, the big thing for us was coming up with something special. I think that the challenge for us at the time was not only to build suspension, but you have to we had to build something unique. That was the challenge for Push, was we had established ourselves as this brand that did these, these high performance products. And so what was our product going to be? What was going to differentiate it from everybody else? And so for us, that was probably the biggest challenge early on was, what is the product going to be? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So walk us into that. I mean, so, what are the problems you see out there to solve, and how did you solve them?
So at that time, we had relocated to Colorado. So Push was here in Colorado, and we were riding big terrain, and a number of us here at Push were riding the Santa Cruz Nomad. And the Santa Cruz Nomad was kind of a go-to bike, big travel, big terrain bike. And the enduro market, long travel trail or enduro market at the time was owned by air suspension. Coil shocks were for downhill, and trail bikes or enduro bikes were air. That's just the way it was. And so we had developed a kit, an aftermarket head unit that we would put onto Fox downhill shocks to apply them to enduro bikes. And that was a really successful product. It was what we called the MX Tune. And so it was a good product, and we did really well with it. But one of the things that you'd find is riding these long travel bikes here in Colorado, you're spending at least the first 35 to 45 minutes climbing. That's the start of your ride. Mm-hmm. And so the coil shocks were if you set it up so it was good climbing, then it wasn't great descending. And if you set it up so it was great descending, it wasn't good climbing. And so that was always a struggle. And so, you had pro pedal levers or on the fly switches that were on air shocks. Nobody had one for a coil shock. And so initially we thought, hey, we should adapt an on the fly lever to lock the shock out, which didn't make a lot of sense on these long travel enduro bikes. And I just had this idea. I was like, man, what these bikes really need is they really need to have a compression characteristic that's optimized for climbing and a compression characteristic that's optimized for descending. That would be if we could do that, imagine if you could have a lightweight, purpose-built enduro shock that had two completely different characteristics that you could toggle between. Now you've got something. Mm-hmm. And so I just started thinking about it, and that's when I came up with the idea for our patented dual valve system. So I just started kind of working out some details, and we built a prototype. We built a prototype head unit that we could put onto a Fox downhill shock. So we had this Fox downhill shock that we cut the bodies in our lathe and put this head unit on, and we built it, and we put it on a hand dyno here at work. So just something you just manually cycle it. And to my surprise at the time, it worked. It was like, and I'll never forget, because everyone's gathered around. We've got this machined, this beautifully machined prototype head unit, and it's all cobbled together with various retaining rings and O-rings and parts and pieces from around the shop. It didn't look very nice, but we put it on the hand dyno, and I'm surrounded by everybody. Everybody's looking and saying, is it going to work? And I cycled it, and then I flipped the lever and I cycled it. And I've never told the people here, but man, it was like one of the most emotional moments ever. I mean, I had to hold back the tears at that moment actually, because I couldn't believe that it worked. Very difficult to execute, but it worked. And so I rode it a couple of times on the Nomad and just thought, this is the technology. I don't want to put this on someone else's product. This is how we're going to build our shock. We're going to build a lightweight, hyper-focused on weight and performance, and have this dual mode shock where you can toggle between a mode that's optimized, because these long travel bikes don't want lockout. They need to have a firmed up compression that can still, especially with technical climbing, give you good traction characteristic and something that's adjustable. And so I wanted a product that had two completely independent modes and that were defined by the user, because different riders had different opinions. Someone who rides a lot of single speeds, they like to stand up and hammer. People like myself who sit and spin, we have a different idea of what we want the suspension performance to be. And so I wanted both of those modes to be determined by the rider with your fingers, no tools necessary. And that hit it. That's what hit the mark.
Was it called the 11.6 yet, or was that yet to come?
Yeah, so the 11.6 is, a story we put out recently kind of on our social media and stuff because, we use SolidWorks for all of our 3D design and simulation, et cetera. And then we have the SolidWorks Vault, the PDM server. So it's just an encrypted server system that allows us to share ideas and have a collaborative workspace. And so I kind of decided, hey, we're going to make I had a phone call with a vendor that I thought we were going to be able to do something with, and they shut me down. And I just said, we're going to go build a shock. So I went downstairs and I announced to everybody, hey, we're building a shock. And I've told this story before. Everybody looked at me and said, yeah, all right, we're going to build a shock. And I said, no, we are building a push shock. I'm serious. This time it's no joke. We're doing it. And they said, oh, we're building I said, yep, we're doing it. And this was at, it's like 4:45 on November 6th. So November 6th of 2013 at about 4:45, I announced we're building a shock. I went up to my office and I had all the CAD models for that frumpy prototype on my desktop computer. And I was like, we're doing this. And so I had to load those files onto the PDM server. And it forces you to, you have to write a script practically. You have to come up with folders and files and project. And I just, I didn't know what to put. And it was November 6th. So I called the project 11.6. And that's what started. So I just named the project 11.6. And so for months while we were developing this thing, internally we called it 11.6. And when we were on the trail talking about it, it was, it was project 11.6. And then fast forward to, hey, we've got to send this thing to market. What are we going to call it? We're horrible at names. Admittedly, we're the company that makes the most high performance stuff with the worst product names. So that's push in a nutshell. Yeah. And so, a marketing friend of mine said, well, what do you call it? I said, well, we call it Project 11.6. He said, well, then call it that. I was like, no, it's a horrible name. And he said, I don't think it's that bad. So long story short, he sketched up some 11.6 logos. And so the next day, after talking to him, this was obviously months after the development started, but the day after I told him what the project was called, he shot me over some logos that were sketched up that said 11.6 in some cool fonts and kind of artsy. And I said, wow, that sort of works. I mean, 11.6 sort of works. And so then Project 11.6 became 11.6. And so that's what we went to market with, was the 11.6, which at the time was a high performance, lightweight, enduro or trail bike specific coilover, which no one had done yet.
Yeah, an amazing product because, again, the end user can get in touch with Push. You tell them who you are, what your riding style is, what kind of bike you're on, because they only do it. Push only does it for certain bikes. It's not for all bikes. You got to make sure you have a bike that fits what they have, and you're expanding that list. And then you, in return, deliver them a shock that should be customized to their needs. What I'm wondering, though, Darren, I've heard you talk a lot about the shock and how people get set up with it. How do you ensure that the rest of the system is set up properly, too? Because, I mean, if I understand correctly, suspension is a holistic thing. Like, you got to have fork pressure right and sag right on the fork and tire pressure correct and weight bias correct as the rider is concerned and braking and all that. So how do you ensure that the other parts are also working correctly so that your shock performs correctly?
Yeah, so we have multiple approaches. So the first one that I'm a big believer in since day one is we publish our phone number, our email, and now we have even online chat tech support available because suspension is a very complex thing and it's very difficult to keep up with all of the terms and features and all of those things. So for me, it starts with having a customer experience that has full support. The reason, so with 11.6, it is a unique animal in the fact that we don't sell it by size. So generally speaking, mountain bike shocks are sold by size. We sell 11.6 by bike. And so what we do is we secure, the reason our list is so small, well, it's growing. I mean, we're up to about 44, 45 bikes now. But one of the reasons why our list is the size it is because we actually secure each and every bike that is on, that we sell a shock for. So, if we offer a shock for a Santa Cruz Mega Tower, that means that we have secured the bike either through Santa Cruz or through a bike shop, whatever sources we need to do. We get the bike, our engineering department rides the bike stock, tunes it, tries to optimize it as much as they can, and that sets the benchmark for performance. From there, we begin developing an 11.6 for the bike. And so instead of selling it by size and tune, we actually build a bespoke unit for that bike. And so the bottoming systems, the compression damping characteristics, rebound, spring rates, we work all of that stuff out for the end user. So the 11.6 is really geared towards the person who's like, I want the most high performance suspension I can get, or I have specific needs or specific desires that I'm looking for, and I don't know how to achieve it, and I don't really have the time. I would rather go to an expert. And so that's what we do, is we provide a turnkey solution. The most, we always say it's the easiest way to upgrade your rear suspension without knowing anything about rear suspension. So the shocks we go through an exhaustive development process. We most of the time send samples to the manufacturer for review as well. Like, here's what we came up with for this bike, to get feedback from the manufacturers as well. We work very closely with all the manufacturers. And then you as a customer, you come to us and you say, hey, this is how much I weigh. This is the bike that I have. This is what I do and don't like about my current suspension setup. And then we take that information and we deliver a product that shows up at your door with the correct spring rate, with the sag already set, with all the compression clickers set, the rebound, everything is preset at the factory, and you have a direct line to the people who built it. And so we have an online, mobile-friendly tech support tool you can use that's bike-specific, so you can pull up your bike and actually go through that process. And then you have complete support. But that's it is the most technologically advanced shock absorber on the market, and it has a bunch of engineering and technology, but ultimately, the whole point of 11.6 is to provide ease of use. Like, how can I get my bike to work better without having to go through this process of learning what all the adjustments do and understanding? It's like, no, let our engineering department do that for you.
So will you recommend front fork adjustments and tire pressure as well, just to make sure that the whole system is functioning properly?
Yeah, I mean, we don't as a general sale, but 100%. We do. Our customer service people do that all day long. So yeah, I mean, again, we are part of the 11.6 is the support, and again, that's the critical element for us. So if you're struggling with setup, or we do get a lot with the front fork, which we're going to have a really good solution for that coming very soon.
Okay.
But yes, we will do. We'll provide complete support on your setup. That is what we're here for.
Our last foray into suspension on this podcast, we talked a lot about data acquisition and telemetry. Mm-hmm. How do you use that? How does that factor into your product development or user experience?
Yeah, 100%. I was an early adopter of suspension dynos and data acquisition from the beginning. I mean, from starting push in 2003, we were using a Racetech data logger back in those days. And that's a tool that we've had in our toolbox ever since. We're big into data acquisition and data logging, big into suspension dynos. We have an entire engineering department dedicated towards that. So for us, the data acquisition is really to continuously improve products and to understand why it is, why does it do what it does? And also to be able to make things repeatable. So for us, data acquisition, it's a paramount tool that we use and has been since day one. So a lot of testing. It's a daily thing that we do here for sure. Yeah.
Are your systems on bike systems? In other words, sensors on bikes and getting a feel for, G-forces or travel or chassis stability and all that stuff?
Yeah, so we use, and again, from our motorsports background, we use the base unit that we use is the AIM. So AIM
right.
Data Acquisition Systems, the Evo systems, which is pretty widely used in mountain bikes these days, mainly for Instagram, I think, not so much for actual development, but it's really great to have it on Instagram. But so the data logging units for us, it's I guess the easiest way to break it down is suspension can be very harsh feeling because it's too soft or because it's too stiff. And that's one of the things that data acquisition really does. Is data acquisition allows us to examine what the suspension is doing. I think that riders and test people, again, something I learned a lot of years ago in motorsports, was to not let the rider try to tell you what's happening, because if they're focused on what the bike's doing, then they're not focused on riding it in the way that they would normally ride it, because they're constantly maneuvering or thinking, oh, did it just bottom out, or etc. And so for us, it's really about understanding. And it's one of the tools I use personally is when I'm riding a new bike and I go out and it has a certain sensation to it and I want to try to improve it. It's like, man, what direction should I go? And looking at data tells you, oh no, the reason this thing feels so abrupt is because it's too soft. And so it's going into the high progression area of the linkage, or it's getting into the bump stop too early. And that's what makes it feel really, really stiff. And so it's like, oh, okay, so I have to stiffen the suspension to make it softer. Mm-hmm. That's counterintuitive, but the data says, yeah, I mean, you're look at how much travel you're using and look at how much acceleration there is. So you got to stiffen it up. On the flip side, you can have that same sensation from a rider's perspective. You can have the same same sensation if the suspension is really stiff and not going through the travel. So you're hitting these impacts and it's not moving. And so the data, that's what it really does, is it takes that objectiveness out of it. It takes the questions out and really starts to allow you to analyze what the bike is doing. And it's an amazing tool. We've grown into a position now where we have to, you really need to have a dedicated person that goes through and analyzes all that data, because it's amazing with technology how much information you can get off the bikes these days.
Yeah, we love data too, because I think a lot of us feel like it's the honest third party, provided we're looking at it correctly, right? We know what we're looking at, we're analyzing correctly. But I've also heard you say, Darren, that feel matters. Like riders should go out when making judgments about their suspension or their setup, they just need to go out and check it out. Do runs.
Yeah.
Tell me what feels faster. What is faster? Time your runs, right? That is something too.
Yeah, I mean, the data acquisition doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what is happening. The whole thing with mountain bike suspension in general, the whole goal is confidence, right? The more confidence you have in the front end, the more confidence you have in the rear end, et cetera. It's all about building a level of comfort and control that gives you, the rider, a confident feeling to tackle this, type of drop or this type of rock garden or these corners. And so I think as cyclists, right, we're always looking to achieve personal goals, right? We're always trying to get through this section of trail, faster than we did before, in a more controlled manner, et cetera. So yeah, I think it would be foolish to use data as a tool to determine if something's working or not. It really should be used as a tool to just tell you what's actually happening. Because at the end of the day, the rider's perception of comfort and control is all that matters. What I like, having ridden a lot of motorcycles my whole life, one thing that is common is people will get on my bikes and say, wow, that's the front end of your bike is really stiff, for your rider weight. And it's because I ride the front of the bike. And so people ride bikes differently. People have different perceptions. Like what I feel is harsh at the handlebars may not be what you feel is harsh at the handlebars, right? It's very subjective. Yeah. And so data as a tool is good to tell you what is actually happening, but ultimately whatever the rider is most comfortable with that's what matters. I mean, that's the end result we're trying to achieve.
Okay. Josh has taught us a lot on this show about tires and tire pressure and the importance of that. And
yeah,
I imagine it's no different even when you have suspension front and rear. So tell us where tire makeup and tire pressure fit into the overall picture here.
Yeah, I'll give Josh a shameless plug. Ever since he came out with the original, mountain bike pump, that is the pump that I still use to this day. Every bike that I have. The tire is the first point of suspension, right? So, I mean, before you have suspension, you have the tire. And so managing that with compounds sidewall stiffness, pressures, all of that stuff is vitally important. And I actually did a little thing on our social media recently where I did a kind of a quiz on what's the first suspension setting you should check, and it was tire pressure, right? Like that's the first thing. Because 1 or 2 psi in a tire, a mountain bike, because today's, again, I'm kind of referring to, my experiences in the enduro category. To be honest, I don't ride cross country bikes. I haven't in many years. It still applies to every category. Yeah. But yeah, for sure. The first thing you should do is check tire pressure. And with modern enduro bikes, because of their large volume, stiff sidewalls, large volume, 1 or 2 psi makes a radical difference. The difference between running 25 psi and 27 psi is immediately noticeable on the trail. And so I'm a big proponent of having a good professional pump that gives you accurate readings. And I use the same pump for every bike so that it's even that constant for me. So yeah, the tire is the first thing that people should check when you're having, even when you're thinking about suspension setups, you're riding trails and you have a certain level of vibration that you're trying to eliminate, or a certain level of compliancy you're trying to improve, or just any changes. I always say the first thing you should check is just try tires first before you start spinning knobs, before you start changing air pressure or change out your coil spring rate, preload. Before you start making suspension adjustments, I would recommend exhausting, like, hey, what are the tire settings? What role does that play? And I honestly think that suspension is a huge topic in mountain bikes, a huge topic. It's, you can find forums and message boards and people's opinions, all over the place. And I think that there's a very small percentage of people that start with a tire. And I think that should be a much larger focus, because experimenting with tire pressures, sidewall stiffness and tread compounds, huge gains can be made.
Yeah, because those forces are just being sent right back up through the 11.6 that you may own, or the Fox fork you have on the front end. That's it. That's your first line of defense right there. So get that dialed.
Yeah, it starts with the tire.
Has machine learning or AI started to play a role in what you do, or how we pinpoint suspension?
Not for us. There obviously is a large shift right now in mountain bike suspension to go electronic. Yeah. And so, the big brands are definitely chasing the electronic thing. At this point, we don't really have any plans. We're definitely more of a mechanical. We believe in a mechanical system. Again, controlled by the rider, simpler, lower maintenance, lower exposure to, something, battery running out, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So for us, no. I think probably industry wide, I think that's probably moving that way. But for us, we're maintaining a mechanical. We really feel like that's our niche, and that's what our customers are looking for. It's coming though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm surprised we're not seeing it in automotive so much, which I feel like tells us something. I remember, oh my God, was it 15 years ago that Amit Bose had his vehicle suspension system that was going to revolutionize everything. Yeah. And then we had rheologic fluids that were going to, and we just kind of keep going, and it's not there. And I think for a lot of the reasons you said, it's maybe not yet robust. It needs more power than maybe we thought it needed.
I think
it's going to be bloody expensive when it fails. Right?
Yeah. I think part of it too is again, there's so much subjectivity, and that's why I think it's important for people to understand with, suspension setup specifically, is that it is subjective. There is no right or wrong. This constant search for like the ultimate setup, it doesn't exist. It might be the ultimate setup for you. And I think that's part of the trouble potentially with electronic suspension, machine learning, these types of things, is that you're on your mountain bike having a specific experience, and that experience is unique to you. And so having some kind of electronic device or machine learning, something that is trying to help tell your story, is very, very difficult, because we're all looking for a different experience. And I think, for me and a lot of riders, part of mountain biking is getting away. It's like clearing your head, and that's true for road too, right? I mean, I love riding my road bike for miles and miles, just listening to a podcast to get away, and so I think, again, that kind of plays a part too, is that having electronic or AI or any of these systems that are going to help improve your ride. And it's just my opinion, but I think that's challenging when you're trying to create your own experience.
Yeah, it's like having aero sensors on your road bike when you're just out cruising with friends. I mean, seems a bit excessive, doesn't it? Suspension is spreading, of course, to gravel now. A lot of gravel bikes being spec'd with suspension. What do you see there, Darren, and do you see opportunity?
I am a huge fan of suspension on gravel and road. If I wasn't so busy, I would be throwing my hat into that ring big time, because I think I definitely have some opinions when it comes to gravel and road suspension. I would love the opportunity to get more involved with that. And who knows, as things progress with push, maybe that's an alley. I think there are huge performance gains in gravel that can be made with suspension. And I'm going to go on record as saying, I think there's huge performance gains that can be made in road cycling. And I think that road bikes can benefit huge from suspension. And I think the efficiency gains and the speeds that can be gained in road cycling. Let me just say, I'd love to get involved with it. And maybe someday I'll be able to have some of these crazy ideas in my head come to life. But gravel. I had the opportunity to ride the Niner. I can't remember what it's called, like the MCR.
Yes, Carpet ride. Yep.
Yeah.
The full suspension bike.
Yeah, this was back years and years ago when it was in prototype form. I also am a big road cyclist. I love riding road bikes and gravel. I love all things bikes. But I had the opportunity. They loaned me one of the prototypes back. Man, I probably had it for like 3 months or something like that. I used it for commuting. I used it for just ripping around. Yeah, I thought it was awesome. I mean, for me, that's my only gravel experience, is riding that Niner prototype. I thought it was awesome. And I think that for gravel, it's the future for sure. Road, I think it's the future as well. And I think that it's going to start with gravel, and gravel is going to go through all of the things that mountain bikes went through, right? All of the, I don't know why it is, but as an industry, we tend to have blinders on. So instead of taking all of the mountain bike, pros and cons, it's like the gravel guys are going to have to go through their own like hard knocks, I guess. But yeah, big fan.
Just like with disc brakes, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like we did all the same stuff that happened in mountain. We did it in gravel. Now we're doing it in road.
Right.
Like, wait, it's like, I've seen this movie before.
Yeah. 100%. But no, I think opportunity is huge in gravel and huge in road. But I think it's much like what we just did with our new front fork that we're getting ready to release. Yeah. I think the key with the gravel market and with the road market is to think differently. I think it's don't try to apply what we currently know to the bike. Look at the bike as what it is and try to come up with a solution or a system that is focused on that. Let's not try to take a cross country race bike air shock and just stick it onto a gravel bike. Let's think differently. There's a lot of technology, man, especially in torsion springs and leaf springs and damper technology. And there's a lot of things you could adapt to make it very streamlined and svelte and light. And so you got to think differently, my opinion. Let's do it. I'm ready to go.
Did we just start something? Did we just start up? No. As we're blowing through an hour here on this, I do want to end with just give us a snippet that your new fork is coming.
Yeah.
I've seen it. It's amazing. Just give us a preview of what that, why that's different and kind of your spin on that. And let's take us out with that one.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah. The fork for me, yeah, it's been, as soon as we launched our 11.6 shock, people said, awesome. Now you've got your shock. Can't wait to have your fork. It's like, oh, okay. Can we just have a breather here? So yeah, we've been under significant pressure over the years to do a front fork. We've wanted to do one. One of the things that people should know about us is that we actually manufacture our products in-house. So we are a full-scale factory here at Push. So we have really large challenges in the fact that we don't outsource our production. We actually do it in our building. And so that's another unique thing that we do. And with the fork, we went down that same path. So part of it was like, hey, how are we going to manufacture this thing in-house? Another aspect of it was, again, what are we going to do different or better? Or, what is our solution? Because ultimately, riding a Fox fork, up until years ago, I was riding a Fox fork and I was very happy with it. Being able to set up and tune a Fox fork, we had come up with our own aftermarket coil kit. So we have our ACS3 coil kit, which converts a Fox or RockShox fork from an air spring to a coil. And so riding a coil front fork with our fork seals and our technology, it was great. And so how are we going to do better? That led into, again, kind of my background in motorcycles, which was asking questions around our building, saying, listen, every high performance motorcycle in the world uses an inverted suspension fork. Mm-hmm. Not most of them, every one of them. And it doesn't matter the discipline. If it's a GNCC, endurocross, motocross, MotoGP, superbike, street, road, it doesn't matter. Not most of them. Every single performance motorcycle in the world uses an inverted fork. Why is that? Why are we not doing this in mountain bike? And everybody says, well, it's been tried. You can't do it. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that's the case, but that doesn't make sense to me. And fortunately, we have a team of people here that's all about like, let's try it. Let's figure it out for ourselves. They say it can't be done. Well, we want to understand why, going back to that intimate working knowledge. Why can't a mountain bike fork be inverted? So that was part of it. And then kind of early on in the process, I realized that a colleague of mine was on the original Honda motocross program where Showa went with on the very first program that put an inverted fork on a motorcycle, on a motocross bike back in the 80s. And so I spoke to him in depth about inverted forks and the challenges that motorcycle went through and why. And we learned a lot from just speaking to engineers outside of our field. But ultimately, we had to build something and try it. And we showed it at Sea Otter for the first time, and it was kind of funny because with all the media people coming around, they were just asking a number of questions about it, and everybody was really taken back by the fact that I told them that the first one we built was horrible. So the first go of it, we built an inverted mountain bike fork, and the guys were all really excited, and I got to be the first one to ride it, and they had it bolted up to a bike, and everybody's like, here it is. We'd spent, I don't know how many months and months, if not, it must've been over a year, doing destructive testing, because we had to do all the simulations, FEA simulations on the crown, the steering tube, all those things being a structural component. We did that. And then we finally built a prototype that was rideable. They said, yeah, it's safe, ride it slow, but everything checks out because, we built our own internal test rigs. So we have our own test department in-house, and we were breaking things left and right and understanding and feeding those back to our simulations, making the simulations smarter. And then ultimately I wrote it, came back the next day, and everybody's in the engineering department. They're like, okay, give us the word. What is it? And I said, this is probably the worst fork I've ever ridden. And they were a little bit in shock. And so anyway, so we went down the path of, like, okay, why is it doing what it's doing? We built a second prototype, and the second prototype months later really wasn't any better. And so at that point, you're kind of stuck with thinking, we've exhausted a year and a half at least trying to build this thing. It's horrible. Not only is it not competitive, it is just not a good product. And for sure, I started thinking, well, maybe you can't. Maybe, I guess you can't.
Right. Maybe they're right.
Maybe they're right. And then we kind of had some breakthroughs, and we had, discussions every single day. The engineering team was working feverishly on all the different prototype pieces and systems. And we built a third prototype, and I'll never forget this moment. I was a trail here in Fort Collins called Sawmill. I rode up and I jumped into Sawmill, and within the first 200 feet, I said, okay, it doesn't suck. Like it's not great, but it's not the worst thing I've ever ridden, And so that was really inspiring. So I came back and gave him the feedback, and then we started progressing. And that was really the moment we realized we've got something. Like, we're going to be able to do it. We now have understood some of the major challenges, and we have a feel for it. And from there, things started to progress very quickly. And it wasn't, by the end of that year. So this would have been early spring when I first rode that one. And by the end of the year, we had a package that was not only competitive, but was starting to make big gains over what was currently available. And so, we have achieved an inverted mountain bike fork that I'm obviously very biased, but it's outstanding. It doesn't suck. It doesn't suck. No. But we did have to build a couple that really sucked in order to get one that didn't. But yeah, it's funny. It was funny talking to the media people and having them say, wait a minute, you're admitting that you built a horrible product? Oh yeah. It was horrible. It was awful. Yeah.
Oh God, those are the best ones. We have a line here around the shop that I got from my friend Andreas Clear, who was a former pro cyclist, and he's now painting and really successfully. Like, he's in galleries in Europe, and they're selling for huge money. Yeah. And so I last time I was in Europe, I stopped to visit him in Majorca, and we went to this amazing art gallery, and there's one of his big paintings for sale for 10,000 euros. And we're standing there looking at it, and I'm like, man, I'm so proud of you. And he looks at me and he goes, it's not shit, right? and so I just love that. And we now use that, there's something yeah, it's not shit. It's not shit. It's not shit. That's a great bar.
Yeah. I'm always a big believer that unless you can be honest about your product, the only way to make better products is to be honest about the performance of it. I've always been a big believer in that. And so if you have to acknowledge if it's not good, you can't just, have high fives because you've worked really hard at it. Just because you've worked really hard doesn't make it a great product. So it's not shit.
It's not shit. I love it. I love it. What, timing wise, when can we expect the fork? How close are you?
It's very, very soon now. We're building them right now. So yeah, so it's
that's super exciting.
Yeah, so we've gone through our first production cycle, which was really challenging. Again, being a manufacturer means that we not only have to design the parts and engineer the assemblies and everything else, but we have to then design the fixtures and create the tool paths, and you have to do all of the supporting items. Yeah. And so the first production of anything is always the longest, because it's the first time you prove out all of the machining tool paths, the material supports, all of the setups, the fixtures, all that. And so we just went through that cycle successfully, and we just built the first pilot batch of forks. And so those have been completed, and that went really, really well, knock on wood. And so now we have the first customer batch. And actually just last weekend or 2 weekends ago now, we started letting customers test ride them. And so customers who are high on the list have had the chance to go out and actually ride one. And I'm happy to report that every single person who had a pre-order that rode it said, here's my money, get it to me as quickly as possible. So that was a good feeling.
Oh, I love it. So I love it. And does it have a name? How'd you name it?
Yeah, again, push the most high performance products with the worst product names. Its internal project name was 9.1. And so it is called the 9.1 or 9.1. So 9.1.
Oh, I'm late. I was going to suggest that it should be the NS something for
not shit. Yeah. No, it's it's the new 9-1, and so coming to
awesome.
Coming to a trail near you very soon.
Oh man, I'm so excited. Well, I've seen the prototype. I mean, amazing stuff. So excited to see it in the wild.
Me too.
Darren, seriously, I always love talking with you. Yeah, this was great.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. And maybe we'll pick back up and do another episode. We go talk about car racing and motorcycles and all that.
I'm totally
super fun stuff.
Totally game for that. Totally
the
game.
new Roubaix bike. That's what I want. You two are going to sit down and draw up the new Perry Roubaix bike, full suspension, a cobble killer.
Oh man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, the technology is there. I think the key with road cycling is just going to be getting riders on it without telling them it's full suspension. Like if you're building the bike, having them ride it, and then be like, "Wow, this bike is amazing," and then telling them it's a suspension bike. I think that's going to be the key.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you got to break the mindset, right? And that's the way to do it. Wonderful,
Awesome.
Darren. Thanks again so much.
For sure.
Awesome having you, and we'll get you next time.
Thanks, guys.